Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Professor Robinson, Professor Lee, friends and students. I prepared a written speech in case I forget. I have the honor at the request of Professor Lee, Chairman of the Economic Department, to say a few words in welcoming Professor James Robinson. Before doing that, allow me to take this opportunity to express my sincere appreciation to Mr. Guo Ji, Chairman of the Old Bank, who donated this Son震Chair Professorship. Mr. Luo is a distinguished alumnus of National Taiwan University from our Economic Department. He has made tremendous contribution to the financial development in Taiwan. He is the first one who issued the credit card in the 70s in Taiwan. He initiated the first securitization of assets. He also organized the first lithium company in Taiwan. 20 years ago, he created his own bank, Taiwan Industry Bank, which later transformed into the old bank, the only tech bank in Taiwan. Mr. Luo is one of the earliest students that I taught in the economic department in the early 60s. Now, we are so pleased to have Professor James Robinson to give his inaugural Son震lecture. Professor Robinson is a university professor of the University of Chicago. Some of you may remember that 6 months ago we had another great economist from the University of Chicago. And our chairman, Professor Lee, also received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. I would like to tell you, almost 50 years ago, I spent 2 semesters, 2 quarters, the spring quarter and the summer quarter at the University of Chicago after I completed my doctorate degree from the University of Oklahoma, and enrolled in the economic department to take courses under the instruction of Milton Friedman. Familiar names: Henry Johnson, unfortunately he left us; Arnold Harberger, Robert Gordon Jr., and the economic historian who later earned Nobel Prize. I cannot recall his name.
Bob Fogel. Is that Bob Fogel? Bob Fogel?
Yes.
Professor Fogel, yes.
Yes. So although my stay at University of Chicago was rather short, only 6 months, but I always claim myself a student of the great Chicago School. Many of you may not know that this university and this country used to be very close to the University of Chicago. Even Dr. Robinson may not know. The early graduate of the economic department in the 50s, Professor George Dill, taught at the University of Chicago Economic Department for years. And 2 American economists taught in our economic department in the 1960s, who later became dean of the business college of the business school of the University of Chicago. One of them is Richard Sachs in the 60s. in the late 1980s, we established a college of management. I asked the dean of the college to go to Chicago Business School for some advices. Many Chicago University economists was invited to Taiwan to give lectures in the 1970s and early 1980s. Milton Friedman visited Taiwan 2 or 3 times, if it's not more. That was the time, I mean the 70s and early 40s, when Taiwan was had a very dynamic economy. We achieved rapid growth, stable price level, and equitable distribution of income. And Taiwan, toward the end of 1970s, was among the so-called 4 East Asia young tigers. As I recall, Mr. Friedman was so fond of Taiwan because at that time, in the 70s, last century, in the 1970s, our government quickly liberalized our economy to become a free market, close to the idea of free market of Milton Friedman, but not quite. I remember once when Friedman was with a group of local economists, he raised the question, why the per capita income in Taiwan was lower than that of Hong Kong? She then answered his question. She said, because Hong Kong has a free economy than that of Taiwan. I caught the thought, how come Singapore per capita income was even higher than the Hong Kong? I believe Mr. Friedman puzzled where he did not answer that question. But that was the golden time in Taiwan economic development. In another occasion, Mr. Friedman was invited to pay a visit to the Council for Economic Planning and Development. And the chairman of the Planning Council was Mr. Yu Guohua. He was a trained economist from Harvard University and London School of Economics before the war and immediately after the war. Mr. Yu was concurrently governor of Central Bank of China. At the Planning Council, Mr. Yu gave a briefing on the performance of the Central Bank of China and that of the Planning Council. After briefing, Mr. Yu asked Mr. Friedman for comment. Friedman said, abolish the Central Bank of China and abolish the Planning Council. Mr. Yu left and said, that would be wonderful because I would be a free man. Several years later, Mr. Yu was appointed premier of the government. He announced the guidelines of his economic policy before the legislative year. The 3 guidelines are liberalization, internationalization, and institutionalization. By institutionalization, he meant to create a legal framework to facilitate market operations and provide incentives to creative enterprises. But since late 1990s, Taiwan seems to have lost its dynamism in economic development. And our economic growth rate in recent years has been stagnant. It seems that Taiwan economy is trapped at so-called high level of per capita income. At this time, we are so lucky and so happy to have another great economy from Chicago University to give us some advices. So let's just applaud our distinguished speaker, Professor James Robinson.
Okay, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to address the slowdown in the Taiwanese growth rate during the course of my presentation, but I'm happy to deal with questions about it. Okay, so I'm going to, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. I always think that, you know, the biggest kind of honor you can get in academia is to be invited to come and do things like this, where everybody has to sit and listen to you. And so I'm very excited to be here, very honored to be here, and I've been learning a lot this week, so it's been great. I'm going to talk about, I'm afraid I changed the title, but the reason is I'm going to give an overview of this new book that Daron Acemoglu and I are just finishing, and we've been battling with the editors at Penguin, and they didn't like the title that we had. So this is the title they like, and I think we're stuck with it. So I thought I should change the slides appropriately. But it's called Balance of Power. You know, by the end of the talk, you'll see what the idea of the balance of power is. Okay? So, and in the title, there's this word liberty. Okay? So I'm going to talk, let me start by talking about liberty, because in some sense, you know, Daron and I are economists, and I'm a political scientist as well, and economics is going to come into it. But I think what we've been trying to think about the last few years is other sorts of dependent variables and different characteristics of life that we think are sort of puzzling, that they exist, that vary a lot in the world, which are probably related to economic development in our view, but which are conceptually distinct. And one is liberty. Okay, so this is a strange dependent variable for an economist to be talking about, but you'll see where it's going. Okay, but let me start by talking about liberty and asking the question, what is liberty and where does liberty come from? So I'm going to use a particular definition of liberty, which comes from a political philosopher called Philip Pettit, who's at Princeton University. And he has this concept, which I've always liked a lot, called non-dominance. Okay? So his idea is, you know, living a fulfilling life is only possible if you're free from the dominance of other people, other institutions, the state, your neighbors, anybody. Okay? So freedom from dominance, fear, insecurity, extreme uncertainty. It's unacceptable, according to Pettit, when you have to live at the mercy of another. Okay? So liberty as non-dominance. So for the philosophers in the audience, you know, there's all of these different sorts of liberty. And right at the end of the talk, if I have time, I'll come and relate what I'm going to talk about to this famous debate about so-called negative liberty and positive liberty. But for now, just think about liberty as being non-dominance in Pettit's terms. And, you know, dominance has, the way he uses dominance is in some sense a very ordinary language-like way. Okay, if you're dominated, then, you know, you're subject to the arbitrary sway and control of others. And Pettit emphasizes a lot that this is not just, it doesn't just, you know, switching into economics jargon, this doesn't have to actually happen in equilibrium. It can be just the threat of dominance or the potential for dominance, which has enormous consequences for your welfare. Okay? So not being dominated is what we mean by liberty. Okay? So here's a question. Where does liberty come from? And I'm going to start by talking about some famous social science theories of that. And using a kind of critique of that to motivate the analysis and the theory. Okay, so if you study like I did in England or United States, the most famous view of where liberty comes from, in some sense, is due to Thomas Hobbes, his book Leviathan. Here's the original front cover, and this looks like a king with a sword, and what's Leviathan? Well, Leviathan was a sea monster in the book of Job in the Bible. Okay, and Hobbes sort of painted a picture of stateless society. We'll come back and we're going to ask later if it's an accurate picture. But here's the famous quote from Hobbes that everybody knows, that the kind of state of nature, the natural state of society, is one of fear, danger of violent death, with a life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes's idea was, what the biggest challenge to liberty is a kind of anarchy of people taking advantage of other people or people dominating other people. And the way you solve that is by creating a very powerful state to create law and enforce law. That's what generates liberty. Okay, that was the argument in Hobbes's book, Leviathan. Okay, so the problem with that argument, the argument in Hobbes, and again, this is a big kind of intellectual discussion that I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to illustrate it with examples, but just to say the problem with that argument is obvious. Okay, the problem with it is that we know from history that states don't just create liberty, states themselves create a lot of illiberty. Okay, so since we're across the sea from China, I thought I'd give you an example from Chinese history, recent Chinese history, and I'll come back to China later on, which is, maybe you've read this book, A Tombstone, which is a kind of first-hand account of the Great Leap Forward and the famine in the 1950s. And this is, probably I have too many words here, but last night I gave a talk without any words whatsoever, and now I have too many words. I think it's, when I get insecure, I start writing, So I can ignore the words. Okay, you know what happened in the Great Leap Forward. It's a very harrowing account of the Great Leap Forward and the kind of economic and human disaster that was created, the famine that was a result not of war in the way Hobbes thought about it. It was a disaster that was foisted on society by the state. Okay, so that's the main point. All right. He has this. He just starts with this description of somebody being beaten to death or struggled, and who was what's the denier? He was it's here. He was a negator of the great harvest. So a negator of the great harvest, and he had to be subjected to struggle, and beaten to death. Okay, but this was the state that was doing it, not some private individual. Okay, so immediately Hobbes wrote his famous book. People like John Locke started criticizing him, saying, "Well, hold on a second. You're going to create this Leviathan. Who's going to control it? Who's going to stop something like the Great Leap Forward being foisted upon the citizens?" And there's a traditional solution in political theory and political economy, which I date to John Locke, but also James Madison, who wrote the US Constitution, is, okay, it's not enough to have a Leviathan. You have to keep the Leviathan under control. And in Western society, there's some very cliched ideas about how you do that. Okay? In particular, James Madison was associated with the US Constitution, had this idea that you have to create a particular kind of institutional architecture to keep the state under control. You have to have democracy and accountability, and you have to have, a system of checks and balances, separation of powers, independent judiciary. That's what gets the Leviathan under control. But I'm going to ask, is that enough? Okay? So, and in the book, we try to motivate, is it enough, with the following example from ancient history, which we call the Gilgamesh problem. Okay? So Gilgamesh is one of probably the oldest surviving written book in human society. it's about 4,200 years old, and it tells the story of Gilgamesh, who was the king of Uruk, okay, in one of the world's first cities. This is the so-called urban revolution in the Middle East. He was one of the world's first cities. Gilgamesh was the king, and the Gilgamesh epic describes at the start, how fabulous Uruk was. See how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. Climb the stone staircase. Approach the Eanna temple. What was the Eanna temple? Well, that's the remains of it today, 4,000 years later. So you can see it was a pretty astonishing construction all those years ago. So I don't know what's happened to this, but luckily Islamic State didn't get this far south in Iraq. So probably it still looks, more or less intact. So you can still see the remnants of that, okay? Approach the Eanna temple, sacred to Ishtar. So the Gilgamesh epic starts talking about, there's all this wonderful stuff. There's an economy, shops and marketplaces, houses, public squares, walls. There's public goods, there's trade, there's an economy. Sounds great. But problem is, Gilgamesh was out of control. Okay? The Leviathan was out of control. He tramples the citizens like wild bulls. I alone rule supreme amongst mankind. So all these good things, but Gilgamesh was out of control. So the poor people of Uruk, they complain to heaven. They cry out to heaven, to the god Anu, and say, look, we're being exploited by Gilgamesh. You've got to do something. Okay? And the god Anu creates the world's first system of checks and balances. So this wasn't James Madison that thought of this. The god Anu thought about it. Okay? And what did he do? It seems a bit eccentric, his solution to this problem. Okay? He created a doppelganger. He created a double of Gilgamesh called Enkidu, and he sent Enkidu to Earth, okay, to check and balance Gilgamesh. Okay? It sounds like a very eccentric idea, but actually, in many traditional societies, this notion of kind of balance, of it's a very common way of restraining power. Okay? Balance within lineages, balance within clans, balance within villages. So it's not, if you think about it a bit, it's not quite so eccentric as it sounds like. But anyway, so here is it. We create a new hero, let them balance each other perfectly. Okay? So it's the James Madison solution. You have a state, the state's out of control. You introduce a system of checks and balances. And Enkidu comes, and it all looks good for the moment. But is it enough? And the Gilgamesh story all these years ago shows that it's not enough. Okay? Why isn't it enough? Here's Gilgamesh and Enkidu. What are they doing? They're killing the bull of heaven. Okay? So it turns out that checks and balances are not collusion-proof, okay, to slip into some economic jargon. In fact, Enkidu may be sent to check and balance Gilgamesh, but they embraced and kissed. They held hands like brothers. They walked side by side. They became true friends. So within about 2 chapters, Gilgamesh and Enkidu are they formed a coalition, okay? And the system of checks and balances disappears out of the window, all right? So they combine to kill the monster Humbaba. It's a long story. They go to what's almost certainly Lebanon. Humbaba guards the cedar forest. And the gods get very upset. They send the bull of heaven to earth, and Enkidu and Gilgamesh combine to kill the bull of heaven. All right? So this is, you have checks and balances, but it's not collusion-proof. Okay? So creating an elaborate institutional architecture, as we're discovering in the United States at the moment, is not collusion-proof. The US checks and balances don't work very well when you have a president and a legislative majority from the same political party, it turns out. Okay? Separation of powers doesn't work very well. Okay? So what's missing? What's missing from this story? Okay? What's missing from the story of Gilgamesh is, how did they get this system of checks and balances? They asked the gods, the god Anu, to send it to them. It was a kind of top-down, they say at the World Bank, it was a top-down solution to the problem. Where's society? Society, you don't really hear much about society in the Gilgamesh epic, okay? But if you ask me, you know, speaking as an Englishman or a European, like, where did liberty come from in Europe? How did they create a state in England or France and get it under control? I'd say the role of society is absolutely critical in thinking about that. Society is missing from this story. It's missing from most stories. It's missing from the normal story about the US Constitution. It's missing from the Gilgamesh epic. But the role of society in European history is absolutely crucial. So let me try to convince you of that for 5 minutes. Okay? And I'm going to do that by going back to Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian, and he wrote a famous book called Germania about the Germans. So if you know something about the history of the Roman Empire, the Rome expanded through France into southern Germany, but they never managed to conquer Germany. They never managed to colonize Germany, and they suffered a series of disastrous military defeats at the hands of these German tribes. So Tacitus was really kind of trying to understand, you know, why was it that the Germans were so kind of invincible militarily and they couldn't be colonized? And in the description of the book, he observes that the way the German tribes made decisions was through in a very participatory way using assemblies. Okay? On matters of minor importance, only the chiefs debate. On major affairs, the whole community. The assembly is competent to also hear criminal charges, especially those involving the risk of capital punishment. So Julius Caesar, also, who fought up here, he wrote about his campaigns in Gaul, in France, and he says similar things. So the German tribes had this very participatory, assembly-based way of making decisions, all right? Why is that significant for understanding British or European history? Well, when the Roman Empire collapsed, Western Europe was overrun by these same German tribes, including people called the Franks. So France, the country France, where does that word come from? It comes from the Franks, okay? And here's Clovis, one of the kings of the Franks, about 500 AD, after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And Clovis was the person who first united a lot of these German tribes. Here he is. I'm going to come back to this. He's being christened. He was a heathen, Clovis. You know, he believed in wood spirits and ancestors. And here he is converting to Catholicism. This is his tomb in Tournai in France. Okay? And what Clovis did was he brought together these very participatory institutions that Tacitus described of the German tribes with elements of Roman state institutions. How do I know he did that? Well, the history of Clovis and that period is actually pretty sketchy. There's a famous book by Gregory of Tours, who was a bishop, called about this period. But here's the earliest existing description we have of how what came to be known as the Merovingian dynasty made decisions. And what's striking about this is about 600 years later than Tacitus's book. But what's incredible to me is how similar it sounds like to Tacitus's description. At the time, the custom was followed that no more than 2 general assemblies, Tacitus talks about 2 assemblies, were to be held each year. All the important men, both clerics and laymen, attended this general assembly. Those of lower station were present in order to hear the decisions and occasionally to deliberate concerning them. Okay? This is Hincmar. He was another bishop. He's describing how these things worked. So this very participatory form of decision-making kind of persisted into the post-Roman, Western Roman Empire and was fused with Roman state institutions. So Clovis, when he started his kingdom, you can see here he merged with the Catholic hierarchy, and he took over the last independent Roman state in France, in Soissons. Okay? And why was that useful to him? Well, there were Roman lawyers who wrote Latin. So what did he do with these Roman lawyers? He got them to write a legal code. He promulgated a legal code. Okay? It's called the Salic law. So there's still elements of the Salic law are law all over Western Europe, but it was promulgated by Clovis earlier in his reign. And I want to focus not on the Salic law, I could talk about it, but on the preface. The preface is incredibly interesting, okay? Here's a preface. This is not all existing copies of the Salic law have this, but this one does, okay? So, therefore, 4 men chosen out of many among them stood out. Their names were Wisogast, Arrogast, Saligast, and Widogast. It sounds like the Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? Okay. So who were these people? They came from the villae of Bonhem, Salahem, and Widerhem beyond the Rhine. So the Franks, the Franks were Germans. They came from beyond the Rhine, coming together in 3 legal assemblies, discussing the origins and cases carefully. They made judgment on each of the cases as follows. So where did the Salic law come from? Okay? The Salic law was a kind of bottom-up codification of social norms. And it was made in assemblies. It was promulgated by Clovis, but it wasn't Clovis decides this is how things are going to be, King Clovis. That's not what he did at all. He got these people and assemblies to kind of collect social norms, practices, customs, and he wrote them down with the help of the Roman lawyers. Okay? So and if you read the Salic laws, it's a kind of fascinating thing to do. Many, many clauses are essentially just codifying feuding practices and vendetta. So the Franks didn't really have a state until this point. So there was a lot of feuding and vendettas, and there was a whole elaborate system of penalties, and in the Salic laws it tells you, how much money you have to pay if you cut off somebody's ear, if you cut their nose off, if you injure their eye, for each different finger. And this was people who were fighting, and then you had to pay compensation, or what they call Wehrgeld, in order to stop a vendetta. Okay, but this is social norms being built into the legal code. Okay, so this is the sort of genius we're going to argue in the book of this European model, which is unlike Gilgamesh, where you have this top-down sort of solution. Here you get this. You have these state institutions which come from the Romans. The Romans had a bureaucracy, they had law, but it gets fused by Clovis with this very participatory Germanic institutions. Okay, so that's France. Let me talk about England. I'm English. I want to talk about England. Okay, now here's a sign. If you're ever in England, if you're ever in London, you go west, along the Thames River. There's a place called Runnymede. Now here's a sign. The National Trust, they protect monuments in England. It says, the birthplace of modern democracy. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. But let me tell you what happened in Runnymede and why it's significant. So Runnymede, here's a meadow. It was the meadow which in 1215, the King John and his barons signed what's called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was like a little constitution in some sense, which enshrined various principles. It enshrined the principle of the king couldn't tax without consultation. And it also enshrined the principle of a trial by the jury of your peers. Okay? But why here? We were thinking they got together, there's a nice meadow, they could have had a game of cricket. Maybe after they signed the Magna Carta, they went and had some beer in the pub at the background. But it's a very significant place, Runnymede. Okay? It's not a coincidence that they signed the Magna Carta or negotiated the Magna Carta in this meadow. Okay? Because the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans inherited this system of assemblies and participatory decision-making from the Germanic tribes. In fact, who were the Saxons? The Saxons were a Germanic tribe. Who were the Angles? Well, the Angles were from Denmark, but, the institution diffused. In Anglo-Saxon England, the assembly was called the Witan. And this was a place where Witans met. Okay? So going back into the so-called, what used to be called the Dark Ages when I was a schoolboy. Okay? So for hundreds of years, these assemblies, these Wittens had met in this meadow west of London, and that's why they negotiated it here. Okay? So if you want to know all these parliaments, you know, Europe, there's all these parliaments all over the place. Like, what the heck, where did these parliaments come from? Like, the parliaments came from this Germanic assembly politics which fused with the Roman state at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And in the English case, there's, you know, in England we love historical continuities. In the English case, you know, there's this historical continuity from Parliament right the way back, you know, 1,500 years to the Witten, the Magna Carta, Runnymede, etc. Okay? So let me bring it to the present. Okay? I'm going to skip that. Let me come right close to the present and talk about what I'm emphasizing here is what's different between Gilgamesh and this European story, and I'm going to talk about other parts of the world shortly, is unlike the Gilgamesh story, here you have this bottom-up and top-down element coming at the same time, all right? So, and let me give you one more British example before I switch to talk about China, okay? What is this? This is the construction of the British fiscal system in the early 18th century. This is the excise revenue round of Supervisor Cowperthwaite. It's a very good Saxon name, Cowperthwaite. Here he is. And this is from his diary, which has survived. And it tells you all of the places that he traveled to early in the 18th century. So he was an excise tax collector. The main fiscal base of the English state at this time was excise taxes, so taxes charged on the production of beer and bread and salt. And so he had to go around and check what people were doing. You know, how much beer was the brewer making? How many loaves of bread was the baker making? He had these sub-excise people spread around the country, but he went around checking, monitoring, okay? So this was really the first moment when the British had a kind of state, you know, which really penetrated society. Okay, suddenly for the first time you were living in rural England, you had a tax collector in your face. Okay, so you could say, you know, we'd say as social scientists, this was a big increase in state capacity. The state got much more effective at raising taxes. Okay, what happened? Well, what happened, as Charles Tilly, the great sociologist, pointed out, was that this development of state capacity created this very vigorous reaction from society. Okay? And in fact, Tilly showed that exactly this, in the same period where Supervisor Cowperthwaite and other people like him were going around the country monitoring people and collecting taxes, there was a dramatic change in the nature of British society. Okay, so he's, you know, here's a quote from Tilly's book. This is a book called Popular Protest in Great Britain, and Tilly was really interested in the emergence of mass society and mass politics and collective action on a national scale in Britain. And what he showed is that over this period, as he says here, the expansion of the state pushed popular struggles from local arenas and from significant reliance on patronage towards autonomous claim-making in national areas. So at the start of the period, the price of bread was high. The price of wheat was high. What did people do? People complained about, oh, the baker, you know, the bread is expensive. The baker, he's gouging us. You know, he's charging too high a price. Or wages are too low. You know, you should put wages up. Like, they'd go to the Lord of the, like, you know, very parochial claims. Like, you know, oh, you know. By the end of the period, when the price of wheat was too high or the price of bread was too high, they'd be blaming the system. They were blaming the system. They were complaining to Parliament. They were organizing mass protests. Now, Tilly's book, you know, it sort of significantly ends in 1833. Why 1833? Because 1832 was the so-called First Reform Act in Britain, which is the sort of the kind of the start of the process that creates mass democracy. So Tilly was interested in the kind of social change that took place prior to the development of democracy. And what I'm emphasizing here now is this interaction between the state and the society. You know, in some sense, what precipitates this change is exactly Supervisor Cowperthwaite and his people. So this interaction between the state and society, that's absolutely crucial. Okay? And we have some terminology for that. You know, if you write a book, you have to have some terminology. We had extractive and inclusive institutions before. And I'm going to call this something. Okay? So I talked about Hobbes and the state. And Hobbes talked about the Leviathan. But what emerged in Britain was a particular sort of Leviathan, which I'm going to call a shackled Leviathan. Why shackled? I'm not really sure I'm convinced. I'm not convinced about the terminology, but anyway, that's where we are at the moment. A shackled Leviathan. I mean, yes, it's a state, but somehow it's a state unlike Gilgamesh, which is under control. But it's not under control because of some abstract constitutional engineering or doppelganger. It's under control because society is very mobilized and empowered to control it, okay? And this interaction between state and society that I'm kind of emphasizing with Supervisor Cowperthwaite and Charles Tilly is a process we call the Red Queen effect. So this competition between state and society kind of is what drives the emergence of this shackled Leviathan, okay? All right. So sounds good. But I guess the point of the book, and I'm going to come right at the end to this notion of the narrow corridor that's in the title, is to say, okay, there's this shackled Leviathan, but how the heck do you create one of those? Okay? You know, in some sense, the story about Clovis and the German tribe, it's a story that impacted all over Western Europe. You know, the German tribes were everywhere. Burgundy in France. Who were the Burgundians? German tribe. Lombard in the north of Italy. Who were the Lombards? German tribes. They spread out all over Western Europe. But it's a very specific historical context that creates that dynamic. Okay? So it's hard to create. Let me give you the example of China. What's interesting about China, at least according to my reading of the history, is that if you go back far enough, it doesn't look so different. In fact, you're going to correct, you know, I got this picture from Wikipedia, so that now there's people in the room who can actually read the Chinese. So maybe this is just like some kind of betting slip, and somebody put it on Wikipedia. But it claims to be this famous book called, and I won't be able to pronounce it either. How do you pronounce that? The Hunzi. So anyway, here's the quote. It's in many books by historians of China, so I guess it's true. I'm not sure. It should be on this page, but maybe it isn't. The ruler is a boat. Not on that page. The ruler is a boat. Commoners are the water. The water can carry the boat. The water can capsize the boat. Okay? So Mark Lewis, who's a historian at Stanford, has written a lot about this. That if you go back to this period... No. We can talk about it later. Okay. I should get the right page. Maybe we can buy the book in Chinese. I'll get the right page. That shows you, students in the audience, don't trust Wikipedia. So what Mark Lewis points out is that if you go back far enough in Chinese history, if you go back before the emergence of the Qin Empire, you go back Warring States period, even before the Warring States period, what you find is all sorts of evidence of assembly-like politics, accountability. So he even makes an analogy between Chinese polities in that period and the Greek city-states. Okay, so this is before they kind of coalesce into these 7 warring states and then the Qin Empire. Okay, so not so different if you go back historically. You know, so this quote is like what? The ruler is a boat, the commoners are the water can carry the boat, the water can capsize the boat. Okay, so people have power. Okay, but then a very new model of how you organize Chinese society emerges. Okay? So I call this the Shangyang model. Here's Lord Shang, who's supposedly the, the intellectual mastermind of the Chinese state. And here's a quote from his, his surviving writings. When the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state that possesses the way, the book is not going to provide a micro-foundation for the way, strives to weaken the people. Okay? But our model, by the end of the lecture, you'll see our model actually has something interesting to say about this. Okay? But here, when the people are weak, the state is strong. So a state strives to weaken the people. Okay? And that's, if you read the book of Lord Shang, he has this model of a top-down state controlling, micromanaging, ruling the population through law. Okay? So that's a model of the kind of relationship between state and society, which is radically different from the model of state and society that emerged in the late Roman Empire in Western Europe. Okay? But it's a model of the interaction between state and society that seems to be incredibly persistent in Chinese history. Nowadays, everybody in the West, we're all very fascinated by China's social credit system. I'm sure everybody here knows about the social credit system. And I particularly like this, this photograph here, which is, here's all the Chinese government are currently putting up 200 million cameras to, Big Brother is watching you, if you ever read George Orwell. Finally, he is, okay? And he's called President Xi. So here's, here's Chairman Mao on the wall of the Forbidden City, and here's all the cameras watching everybody, watching him, okay? So this isn't, this is the modern incarnation of the Shangyang model of state-society relations, it seems to me. And so we're going to call that something very different. We're going to call that a despotic Leviathan. And, of course, there's many other things we could talk about, but as compared, just some salient things as compared, let me say two things. One thing is a radically different notion of the law. I pointed out with the Salic law, the origin of the Salic law is this formulation of customary practices in society. Okay? In England, it's the same thing. If you look at the first legal codes in England, King Offa, King Alfred, they're very, very similar. They're a kind of formal, they're a kind of transcription of customs and social norms. And then you have this evolution of these legal systems. They rediscover Justinian's legal code and they start incorporating ideas from late Roman law, etc. But that's a radically different model of the legal system. If you compare that to existing fragments of the Qin legal code, for example, that's a much more kind of top-down, despotic, this is like Lord Shang type of, this is how we organize society. So I think that is a very stark difference. The other thing, of course, is that apart from in this very early period that I was talking about, any kind of notion of representation disappears in China. Okay? So this, unlike this kind of balance between state and society I talked about in European history, here in some sense what you have is a situation where the state dominates society. Okay? So you have a kind of asymmetric situation where the state dominates society. Okay? So I'm going to say, and we try to illustrate this in the book, I think, this is a, if you think about Pettit's definition of liberty that I started with, this is illiberty, okay? So there's no liberty in Pettit's sense in China. It's a totalitarian system, and they're perfecting it as we speak, okay? So this despotic Leviathan does not create liberty, okay? But what's interesting is, things always come in threes, right? If you're a student, you must have noticed this. Like, this is what professors call the iron law of three. Like, there's always three reasons why something happened. There's like three reasons why the First World War started. There's three reasons why Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War. If you tell students two reasons, they think there's something missing. But if you tell them 4, they get confused. Okay, so now we have the Shackled Leviathan and the Despotic Leviathan. There's something else. And you can kind of see the something else because there's a symmetry here, right? So the Shackled Leviathan is when you have this balance between state and society. The Despotic Leviathan is when the state dominates society. But couldn't there logically be a situation where society dominates the state? How could that be? Well, let me give you an African example. So this is Nigeria in West Africa, and this is where the Tiv ethnic group live. Okay, so the Tiv ethnic group were a stateless society at the time of European colonization. Okay, and I'm going to tell you a little story about the Tiv, which is very telling about state-society relations, I think, in the world. Okay, and I'm going to come at it in a rather strange way. Tivland, that's what you call this, is Tivland. Okay, so the Tiv, it's very, anyway, they have their own language, their own history, etc. So in 1939 in Tivland, during the British colonial period, there was troubles in Tivland. They called it troubles. Why is that? A cult, like a religious cult, emerged. Okay, and the cult was called Nyambua. And the cult kind of went like this. There was a guy called Kokwa who was selling protection against witches. Okay, so you go, you pay some money, and you had to drink some potion, and he'd give you a fly whisk. What do I mean by a fly whisk? Okay, so here's a Tiv, this is a fly whisk. Okay, so here's a Tiv diviner. So this is a guy who finds witches. Okay, so you joined the cult because you were scared of witches. And once you had this fly whisk, the whisk helped you find witches. Who was a witch? Okay, now, to understand what happens next, you have to understand the Tiv word, which is sav. So sav in the Tiv language means power. But it particularly means like powerful people. Okay? So when I used to teach at Harvard, I'd always give the example of Larry Summers. And Larry Summers, who was the president of Harvard, very distinguished economist. Also, he's a very powerful man, like very witty, like a lot of charisma. Larry Summers would come into a room, everyone would like be quiet and pay attention. Okay? So Larry Summers was a man of sav. Okay? Very powerful, very charismatic. But the thing about sav is that some people are just like that. But the thing in Tiv society, you could also acquire sav through cannibalism, okay, illicitly. And one of the important things about this fly whisk is it would allow you to smell out illicit sav. Now, the next part of this is the word mbatsav, which is the plural of sav, powerful people. But it also means a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes, in particular, robbing graves to eat corpses. Now, this is sort of like, it turns out, the word politician having two meanings. On the one hand, politician means a group of people who contest for political office, but it also means a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes, such as robbing graves to eat the corpses. Okay? So what's going on here is that, think about hierarchy, or political hierarchy, or a state, or authority, or somebody has to give other people orders. Okay? In Tiv society, as soon as somebody started getting too influential or too powerful or too big for their boots, they were immediately accused of being a witch. Okay? They were accused of being a member of the Mbatsav. So the Tiv never developed any kind of political hierarchy. Why is that? Because they were so worried about people abusing their power. Okay? It's sort of like the anticipation that if you create a Leviathan, it's going to exploit you, means you do everything you can to stop that happening in the first place. Okay? So that's really the story here. You know, I won't go into that photograph. After you died, salve is also a sort of physical substance on your heart. So after someone dies, you can examine their corpse and to see if they've been killed by witches. But let me not go into that. Anyway, so here's a quote, you know, from Paul Bohannon, who was the great social anthropologist of the TIV. Very interesting because he was interested in politics. That's why I like the TIV so much. And you know, this is what I said. Men who acquired too much power were whittled down by means of witchcraft accusations. It was a Nyambua, that cult that I described. It seems so idiosyncratic, but it turns out to be just one of a series of movements to which TIV political action, with its distrust of power, okay? That's what I want to emphasize. Distrust of power gives rise to, so that the greater political institutions based on the lineage system and egalitarianism can be preserved, okay? So here's the mechanism which creates these other type of societies, okay? In the despotic societies, you know, you get this accumulation of power and hierarchy. But in some contexts, societies can organize themselves to make sure that never happens, okay? So we call this in the book the slippery slope, okay? You're worried that if you start creating hierarchy, you're on a slippery slope and you can never control it, okay? But I should say, and I think this is important, that is this a Hobbesian society, the TIV? Remember I talked about Hobbes, and I said, Hobbes said, you know, the biggest threat to liberty is anarchy. People killing each other, fighting, brutish, short, violent life, okay? So now we've talked about a real society which didn't have a state. Was it a Hobbesian society, okay? And I think the answer to that is no, because most societies like the TIV managed to organize themselves in ways which avoided Hobbesian-type phenomenon, okay? And they did that by creating what we call in the book the cage of norms, okay? So any type of society like the TIV created very dense social norms that made it very difficult for society to kind of disintegrate in the way Hobbes talked about, okay? So, you know, if you've read some anthropology or historical literature, you know there's a lot of debate about the extent to which society before the state really looked like Hobbes portrayed it. In the 1960s, you know, Marshall Salins wrote an article called The Original Affluent Society, about how stateless societies were actually harmonious and egalitarian, and they weren't violent and warlike. But, you know, I think that Salins was right in some sense, but not in other ways, okay? And I was going to motivate that with another ethnographic example, okay? But here, I think, I like details, but I don't want you to get lost in the details. The thing to keep an eye on here is these three configurations. There's this balance of power in the middle, which creates this shackled Leviathan. When the state overwhelms society, like in China history, we call that a despotic Leviathan. But you also get this other side of things where society basically overwhelms the state, okay? So maybe I'll skip this because it's going to get, let me not talk about Zambia, but let me give you one example and I'll try to pull the threads together. One very contemporary example. Now you might think I'm talking about the TIV, a sort of ethnographic society. Is that relevant? Yeah. This is Lebanon in the Middle East, okay? So Lebanon is an example of a close to state-like, stateless society. There's a state in Lebanon. They have an ambassador in Washington, D.C., and probably do you have ambassadors in Taipei? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway. No ambassador in Taipei. Okay, in the future. When Taiwan becomes an independent republic. Lebanon, you know, it has an ambassador to the United Nations. Okay. But the Lebanese state has no power whatsoever. There's no tax system. There's no income tax system in Lebanon. They haven't had a census since the 1930s. The Lebanese government doesn't collect information. Why? Same as the TIV, because society is very organized and society doesn't want to give power to the Lebanese state. Okay? And what I want to emphasize here is how this situation, I was going to give an African example, but maybe that's too obscure, so let me give this Lebanese example, which at least drives home that this is not some strange historical artifact. There's lots of places in the world where these mechanisms today are important, okay? And Lebanon is one of them, okay? And the point here is to emphasize that this situation creates a certain type of society, because in any society where you're trying to avoid this slippery slope, you're trying to avoid the creation of kind of dominance, you do that in many ways which create a particular sort of society, a very fragmented society. So these are protests in Lebanon, and it's a movement which was called the like hashtag You Stink. Okay, what's the hashtag You Stink movement in Lebanon? Well, I said the Lebanese state was really lousy at doing everything, including collecting trash. Okay, so clean up the trash in the parliament. That's a kind of ironic remark. There's a parliament, but people basically never show up for work. They just had an election this year which was delayed for years and years and years. They maybe come to parliament 10, 15 days a year, and so it's a sort of nobody really does anything. People are complaining about the trash and about the parliament. Okay, you recycled the parliament, now recycle the trash. Okay, so here's from the You Stink. This was a social movement which was trying to organize to clean up the trash and get the government doing something. And it collapsed. And this was from their Twitter feed, sort of frustrated, okay? Our movement, since its outset, has been accused of being a partisan of the Al-Mustaqbal future movement, working against the rights of the Christians on the Tayar website. Then we were accused of being partisans of the 8th of March bloc, working against the, okay. As for the movement's members themselves, we've been accused of being partisans of Walid Jumblat. Walid Jumblat is the head of an ethnic group called the Druze, foreign embassies, the Amal movement, Hezbollah, you may have heard about Hezbollah. That's a big Shia group with its own army and its own welfare state, its own hospitals, its own fiscal system, its own welfare system. And what's remarkable about this is this You Stink movement, a kind of social movement trying to get the state to provide services, to get things working, disintegrated because of the incredibly fragmented nature of Lebanese society. Okay? So unlike the people that Tilly was talking about in 18th century England, who kind of reacted to this expansion of the state by organizing collectively and actually forcing this democratization in 1832, in Lebanon, this attempt to act collectively just kind of disintegrated because the society was so fragmented and fractured, nobody trusts anybody else. You have, and it all collapses, okay? So this is just to say there's a certain type of organization of society which is important for this story. I'm not going to talk about the one bit I was going to talk about the economy, I'm going to skip it. Okay, so here's the picture, all right? So here's a picture. If you like phase diagrams and differential equations, we have a model of this on our webpage. So, but I was, this is just the fun version. Okay, so think about on the horizontal axis, I've been talking about the power of society. What do I mean by the power of society? I really mean, I mean social norms, I mean the ability of society to act collectively. Okay, and on the vertical axis, we have the power of the state. Maybe that's easier to conceptualize, the despotic power of the state, the ability to repress, raise taxes or whatever. Okay, and in some sense, there's three basins of attraction here, for those of you who like differential equations, okay? If you start off in a situation where, an asymmetric situation where society dominates the state, then you sort of converge down here, this is the TIV, This is Lebanon. We call this the absent Leviathan, where society dominates the state. On the other hand, if you start with a different balance, where the state is stronger than society, then you get to something like this Chinese equilibrium. The state accumulates power, society decumulates, and you have what we call a despotic Leviathan. But this picture is meant to emphasize that this divergence that you get is not, it's a consequence of this kind of intrinsic dynamics, this interaction, this contest between state and society. It's not a story about big differences in geography or big differences in culture, and in fact, when I started talking about China, if you recall, I emphasized that, if you go back far enough in Chinese history, it doesn't look so different. China was just a little bit to the left of this locus here. And maybe the late Roman Empire or the early Frankish kingdoms were just a little bit to the right of that locus, okay? Because in between this basin of attraction of the despotic Leviathan or the basin of attraction of the absent Leviathan, there's what we call the narrow corridor, okay? It's the narrow corridor here, and it's in this narrow corridor that what I call this Red Queen effect operates. That's what Tilly was talking about, this interaction between state and society, where society pushes, the state pushes society, or society pushes the state, okay? And that's where you get to this so-called shackled Leviathan, okay? So the balance of power comes from, where do you get liberty? Well, there's not too much liberty in TIV society, Why is that? If there's no war. Well, because there's this web of norms that, I didn't talk about that too much, but you're in this cage of norms that massively restricts what you can do. There's not much liberty in despotic society, because we saw that in the Chinese case, all those 200 million cameras, and it's here. So, some implications. Let me talk about some implications and then I'll shut up. I won't talk about negative and positive liberty. I'll shut up and let you ask questions. Okay? So, my mother used to say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Okay? So what's some implications of this? Well, the first implication is Lord Shang was wrong. He was wrong. Why was he wrong? Remember, he said, when society is weak, the state is strong. That's not what this says, okay? Here, the strongest states are the places with the strongest societies, okay? In fact, you need the society to drive the state, to push the state, to accumulate capacity or strength. If the strength crushes society, then that competition doesn't occur, and you end up with a state which has less power, okay? So, second implication. A few years ago, George W. Bush, the previous president of the United States, used to say, just let the Chinese economy grow, we'll encourage economic growth, and then modernization will create democracy in China and everything will be fine. Not what this implies, okay? There's no natural process of convergence in these dynamics. In fact, these dynamics suggest that you'd expect the world to kind of sort itself into these different steady states, okay? So the dynamics take you in these different ways. Of course, societies change in history and societies move, and there's a lot of discussion of that in the book, but you can ask me questions about that. But I don't want to get into that here. I want to emphasize these historical dynamics and say, the first order story here is that there's nothing intrinsic about, you won't expect countries to converge to the same sorts of institutions. So there's no end of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it. Okay? Third thing, which I've kind of emphasized already, is, getting a shackled Leviathan is not about some top-down founding fathers, getting together in Philadelphia and coming up with some elaborate constitutional architecture. Okay? The role of society is critical, and of course I haven't talked about the United States, but that's equally true in the history of the United States. Okay? The role of society is critical, but to get that role being played in a constructive way, you need the right sort of society. So the reason that example of Lebanon is interesting is that is not, the Lebanese society is not the sort of society that can create these Red Queen dynamics, okay? It's fragmented, people don't trust each other, it's kind of locked into this zero-sum competition with each other, okay? So to achieve this, society somehow has to escape what we call this cage of norms that stops it acting collectively, okay? Fifth thing is that, I'm not going to have time to talk about it, is that one thing that I think is important to understand is that, you know, if you think historically about how societies got themselves into this corridor, there's a lot of dirty deals. You know, in the case of the United States, the dirty deal is to do with the treatment of slaves and black people. You know, I always like the example of, you know, there's that famous song in Chicago. You know, from Chicago. I live in Chicago. Chicago is the start of Route 66. You know, Route 66. You know that song? Get your kicks on Route 66. Well, it turned out that it was mostly white people who could get their kicks on Route 66 because half of all the counties in the United States that Route 66 ran through until the 1960s had what they called sundown towns. Okay? And sundown towns, you couldn't be in a sundown town after dark if you were black. In fact, the situation was so bad that starting in the 1930s, a special book was written called the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was specially for black people to tell black people where it was safe to be after dark. I mean, it's one of the things. It was also, it told you where you could actually go to the toilet, because lots of toilets were just for white people. So it had a list of like where there were toilets for black people and which filling stations would sell petrol to black people and not white people. And so, you know, so I don't have time to talk about that. But you know, there's a lot of discussion in the book about how do you get into this corridor, and you know, and there's a lot of dirty deals involved in that sometimes. Okay, and also last thing, you know, the story here is there's nothing uniquely Western about liberty. Okay, you know, think about the TIV. You know, to me, one of the, you know, to me, I work a lot in Africa. One of the things that distinguishes Africa is like Africans love being free. You know, Africans just, they don't like being told what to do. They don't like rules. They love liberty. You know, there's nothing Western about liberty. And, you know, there's no big, this is not a big sort of structural theory. You know, the argument here is that small differences in historical conditions can put societies onto very different types of trajectories, and I've just sort of tried to give you a little bit of flavor of that. Okay, so I think that let me stop here. Let me stop here. I didn't talk about economics at all, but
economics is everything.
And I didn't talk about the money supply. But you know, Milton Friedman talked about capitalism and freedom. I guess, you know, where I would differ from Milton Friedman, at least in terms of capitalism and freedom, is that, you know, this is not a theory about how a particular organization of the economy creates liberty. No. Our view is that, you know, here you can see from this is that liberty is created by a particular kind of balance of political power within society. So I think, you know, I would say, I'm not disputing his correlation, but I guess my view would be the causality runs the other way round, and most of my work is about, you know, the political determinants of comparative economic development. But this book is really much more focused on trying to understand these long-run political dynamics. You know, why is it, if you've read Why Nations Fail, you know, why is it that some parts of the world ended up with much more inclusive institutions and much more prosperous societies than others? So this book is trying to sort of think about the kind of long-run dynamics of political institutions that created that political and economic inclusion. So So let me be quiet and people can ask questions. Thank you.